The one they always come for is the one who never said no. The one who showed up every time, who called back first, who learned to carry things quietly because making noise felt selfish. That's the rule nobody writes down. The softest person in the family becomes the load-bearing wall, and nobody notices until they crack. I was 29 when I drove 6 hours to spend Christmas with my grandfather. I wasn't planning to. I had a trip booked. 4 days in Colorado with 2 friends I'd been canceling on for 3 years straight. Flights paid. Hotel booked. I was packed. Then my uncle called on a Tuesday night and said Pop was having a rough patch and maybe someone should check in over the holidays. He said it the way people say things when they want you to do something but don't want to ask directly. Casual. Just a thought. I called my aunt. She said she was sure Pop was fine. She said it with the kind of confidence that meant she hadn't actually talked to him. I canceled Colorado. I drove north. The house my grandfather has lived in for 41 years is on a 2-lane road outside a town called Merrill, about 20 minutes from anywhere that matters. White siding, green shutters, a porch with 3 steps and a railing he put up himself in 1987. There's a birch tree in the front yard that lost half its branches in a storm 5 years ago, and he never had them cleared because he said he liked how it looked. Stubborn, that's the word everyone uses for him. Stubborn, opinionated, sharp. I pulled into the driveway at 4 in the afternoon. The lights inside were off. That wasn't strange. He hated overhead lights, always had. But the curtains were drawn on every window, which was strange, because he said curtains were for people who had something to hide. I knocked. Nothing. I knocked again, longer this time. He opened the door on the 3rd knock. He was wearing the same flannel shirt I'd seen him in at Thanksgiving 2 months earlier, but it wasn't the shirt that stopped me. It was his face. He looked at me for a second like he was trying to place me, and my grandfather has known my face since the day I was born. That second, that half second where he wasn't sure, I filed it away and didn't say anything about it. You came, he said. I said I would. He stepped back and let me in. The kitchen was what I noticed first. There was a single pot on the stove with what looked like 3-day-old oatmeal dried to the bottom, half a loaf of bread on the counter. In the fridge, 2 eggs, a container of margarine, a jar of pickles, and a quart of milk that had gone sour. That was it. That was the whole fridge of a man who used to keep a kitchen that could feed 12 people on 4 hours' notice. I didn't say anything about the fridge either. I closed it and asked him what he felt like for dinner. He said he wasn't very hungry. I drove to the grocery store in Merrill and spent $200 and came back and made him a real meal. And while I cooked, he sat at the kitchen table and told me about a bird that had been coming to the feeder outside all week. He described it in detail. He seemed more like himself with something to talk about. We ate. He went to bed at 7:30. I sat at that kitchen table for a long time. My grandfather's name is Walter Orrin Bassett, and he will turn 81 in March. He raised 3 kids in that house. He worked at a paper mill for 26 years. He coached Little League for 11 seasons and never once complained about the drive to away games. He is the kind of man who writes thank you notes by hand and sends birthday cards 3 days early so they arrive on time. He is not a man who should have 4 items in his refrigerator and dried oatmeal on his stove at Christmas. I called my uncle the next morning while my grandfather was still asleep. I told him what I'd found. He said, I'm sure he's just been off his routine. The holidays do that to people. I said, when did you last see him in person? Silence then. September, I think. It was December 23rd. I asked him what the plan was for Christmas. He told me they were doing it at my aunt's house this year and that Pop had decided he didn't want to make the drive. I asked when Pop had said that. He said my aunt had handled the details. I hung up and called my aunt. She answered on the first ring, which surprised me. She sounded cheerful, the kind of cheerful that's already prepared its answers. She told me the same story. Pop didn't want to drive. He'd said as much. It was his decision. She said she'd offered to pick him up, but he'd refused. She said sometimes people at his age just preferred quiet holidays. I said he's alone and there's no food in the house. She said he's always been independent. You know how he is. I did know how he was. I knew how he'd been. What I was looking at now was something different. My aunt and uncle live 40 minutes from that house. 40 minutes. And my grandfather, who they described as choosing to be alone, as preferring quiet, had opened his door for me like I was the first person he'd seen in weeks. Because I probably was. That morning, after he woke up and we had coffee together, I started paying closer attention. I watched him. Not in a weird way, just the way you watch someone when you're trying to figure out how they really are versus how they say they are. He was sharp in some moments, Funny, actually, had a line about the neighbors that made me laugh out loud, and in other moments he'd drift a little, lose the thread, come back like he'd just stepped out of a room. There was a notepad on the kitchen counter. He had written things on it in his careful, small handwriting. Reminders, pills, morning, locked door at night, call, but the name after call was scratched out, written again, scratched out again. I asked him if he'd seen his doctor recently. He said he had an appointment in January. I asked who was taking him. He looked at the table. I'll figure that out. After lunch, I asked if I could help him sort through some papers. He'd mentioned in September that things were getting a little backed up, and I figured it was something useful I could do. He showed me to the small room he uses as an office. It was the room that used to be my mother's bedroom before she moved out, and I started going through the stacks on his desk. That's where I found the envelopes. There were 11 of them, all unopened, all from the same financial firm. They were dated across a span of 7 months, and there was a folder underneath them, the kind with the 2 metal prongs inside, and when I opened it, I found documents I was not prepared to find. 3 months ago, someone had filed paperwork to establish a financial power of attorney over my grandfather's accounts. That someone was my aunt. My grandfather had signed it. Or there was a signature on it that was supposed to be his. Looking at it, and I've seen my grandfather's signature on birthday cards and Christmas checks my whole life, something about it was off. The pressure was wrong. The letters were wider. It didn't look like someone who'd signed his name 10,000 times. It looked like someone who'd been told where to sign and done their best. I sat in that room for probably 20 minutes without moving. Then I took photos of everything, every envelope, every page of the folder. I put it all back exactly as I'd found it, and I went back to the kitchen and asked my grandfather if he wanted to watch television. He said yes. We watched an old Western he liked. During a commercial, he turned to me and said, without any setup, "Your aunt's been handling the money stuff. I can't keep track of it all anymore." He said it like he was telling me about the weather, neutral, matter of fact, like he'd already made peace with it. I said, "Is that okay with you?" He thought about it, really thought about it, which told me something. "She said it was just easier," he said finally. Just easier. For whom exactly? That night I called my cousin, my uncle's son, who was the one person in the family I trusted to be straight with me. He's 34, works in Charlotte, doesn't go in for drama. I told him what I'd found. I read him the dates off the documents. He went quiet. Then he said, "That was right after Pop's fall." I hadn't known about a fall. My grandfather had fallen in September, a bad one apparently, in the driveway. My aunt had driven him to urgent care. He hadn't told me because he didn't want me to worry. Classic. In the aftermath of that, my aunt had started helping more. Managing appointments, handling paperwork, making decisions, and somewhere in that window those documents had been signed. My cousin said, "How much is in his accounts?" I didn't know yet. But my grandfather had worked for 26 years, had a pension, had a paid-off house, and had been careful with money his entire life. There was a reason someone found it worth the effort to get their name on it. The next morning was Christmas Eve. I made breakfast. Eggs, toast, the good coffee I'd bought at the grocery store. While my grandfather ate, I asked him carefully how he'd been feeling since September. He talked more than he had since I'd arrived. He told me about the fall, about his hip, about the PT appointments he'd missed because nobody had taken him. He told me he'd tried to call my uncle twice about getting a prescription picked up, and my uncle had said he'd get to it and never had. He wasn't angry when he said it. That was the worst part. He'd moved past angry into something quieter and more resigned. This was just how things were now. After breakfast, I stepped outside and called a lawyer. I know a woman named Patricia Fossey who practices elder law in the city where I live. She went to law school with a friend of mine, and I'd met her twice at birthday parties and liked her immediately. She was direct, didn't hedge, told you what she actually thought. I found her in my contacts and called her at 9:15 in the morning on Christmas Eve. She answered, which I was not expecting. I apologized for the timing. She said don't worry about it and told me to start from the beginning. I talked for 15 minutes. She listened without interrupting. When I was done, she said 3 things. She wanted to see the photos of those documents. She wanted to know if my grandfather had a regular doctor we could contact. And she said the phrase I'd been turning over in my head since the night before, financial elder abuse, was worth taking seriously here, not just as a description of what might have happened, but as a legal category with real remedies. I sent her the photos. She called back 40 minutes later and said the signature issue alone warranted a closer look. She said she would connect me with an elder law attorney in my grandfather's county. She said these things moved slowly, but that the first step was documenting everything and getting my grandfather assessed by his own doctor, not just anyone. I spent Christmas Eve reorganizing my grandfather's kitchen, making a list of every bill and appointment I could find, and cooking the meal I used to watch my grandmother make every year before she died. Prime rib, roasted carrots, the good rolls. My grandfather sat at the counter and told me how she'd always burned the first batch of rolls on purpose because she said you had to sacrifice to the oven. I'd heard that story 6 times and I laughed like it was new. We ate at 6. He fell asleep in his chair at 8. I stayed up until midnight going through more papers. My uncle called on Christmas morning. He said he hoped Pop had a good holiday and that they'd try to get up to see him in January. He did not ask how the food situation was. He did not ask about the appointments. He asked if Pop seemed okay, and when I said we need to talk about some things, he said he had to get the kids ready and that he'd call me later. He didn't call later. I stayed 4 days instead of 2. On the second day, I drove my grandfather to his doctor's office and explained the situation to the front desk and asked if we could get a walk-in appointment given the circumstances. The doctor saw us that afternoon. She was thorough. She spent 45 minutes with him, ran through a cognitive assessment, checked his medications, some of which hadn't been refilled on schedule, and at the end she stepped into the hallway with me and spoke quietly. She said he was showing some early signs of cognitive decline, nothing severe, but enough to require support and monitoring. She said he should not be living alone without regular check-ins. She said that if there were concerns about his financial arrangements, she could provide documentation that would be relevant to any legal review. I asked her to please put that in writing. She did. I stayed through the 28th. On my last full day, I sat with my grandfather at the kitchen table, the same table we'd sat at my whole life, and I told him what I'd found and what I was doing about it. I didn't dress it up. I told him straight. I'd found the documents, I'd talked to a lawyer, I was going to follow up on his behalf. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I didn't want to cause a fuss. I said, I know, that's why someone did this. He looked out the window at the birch tree for a while. Then he said, you sound like your grandmother. I drove home on the 29th. From the car, I sent my uncle and my aunt a text. One text to both of them, no pleasantries. I said I had reviewed the financial power of attorney filed in September, that I had documented concerns about its execution, that I had connected with an elder law attorney who would be reaching out to review the arrangement, and that I expected full cooperation. I said my grandfather's doctor had provided a written assessment confirming his current needs, and that any financial decisions made on his behalf since September would be subject to that review. My aunt responded in 6 minutes. She said I was overreacting and that she had only ever tried to help. My uncle responded in 22 minutes. He said we should talk about this as a family. I said we will. Through the attorney. My grandfather's primary care doctor referred us to a geriatric specialist in January. The elder law attorney submitted a formal request for an accounting of all transactions conducted under the power of attorney going back to September. It took 11 weeks. When the accounting came back, there were 17 transactions totaling just over $41,000 moved from my grandfather's main account into an account my aunt controlled jointly with her husband. The explanation provided: household management and caregiving expenses. For a man living alone in a paid-off house, receiving a pension and Social Security, for whom there was no record of any professional caregiver ever being hired. The attorney filed a petition to revoke the power of attorney. She also filed a report with Adult Protective Services. My aunt retained her own attorney. There were emails that were formal and then less formal and then not civil at all. My uncle tried to call me 3 times in March. I let it go to voicemail each time and forwarded the voicemails to our attorney. That's not coldness. That's what you do when every conversation is a potential piece of evidence. In April, the probate court held a hearing. I took 2 days off work and drove back up to Merrill. My grandfather got dressed up, real dress pants, his good jacket, the tie he wore to my cousin's wedding. We sat in a courtroom that smelled like old carpet and floor wax, and I watched my grandfather tell a judge, in his careful, measured way, that he had not understood what he was signing in September, that he had been told it was just paperwork, that he had trusted his daughter. He didn't cry. He's not a man who cries in public. But his voice got very quiet at the end, the kind of quiet that means something is being held carefully in place, and I had to look at the wall for a minute. Judge Caro, patient, methodical, the kind of judge who takes her time, revoked the power of attorney. She ordered a full accounting and repayment of any funds used for non-legitimate expenses. She appointed a professional fiduciary to oversee my grandfather's finances going forward, with quarterly reporting. She also referred the matter to the county district attorney's office for review of potential criminal charges. I'm not going to tell you the family is fine now. It isn't. My aunt hasn't spoken to me since April. My uncle has reached out twice, both times with some version of, "Can we put this behind us?" And both times I've said the same thing. I'm focused on Pop. What I can tell you is that my grandfather got his money back. Not all of it, not yet, but the fiduciary's working through it. He has a medical aide who comes 3 mornings a week. He has a direct line to a pharmacy that delivers. He has someone who takes him to appointments. His refrigerator has food in it. He called me on a Thursday night in May, just to talk, the way he used to call when I was in college. He told me about the birch tree. New growth was coming in on 2 of the broken branches. He said he wasn't sure if they'd hold, but he was keeping an eye on them. He sounded like himself. Not the version I'd found in December, alone in a dark house with dried oatmeal on the stove. The other version. The one who writes thank you notes by hand and sends birthday cards early and coached Little League for 11 seasons and never complained about the drive. I didn't go to Colorado. I'm not sure I regret it. The question I keep coming back to isn't really about my aunt. It isn't even about what she did or why. The question is older and simpler. How many people are sitting in houses right now, the refrigerator running low, the pills going unfilled, trusting that someone is handling it, because they were raised not to make a fuss, because they don't want to be a burden, because they made the mistake of being easy to love and easier to overlook? I didn't save my grandfather. He was never someone who needed saving. He needed someone to show up and pay attention. That turned out to be me. Because I was the one who answered the phone when my uncle called, because I canceled a trip I'd been looking forward to, because I drove 6 hours on a Tuesday and noticed the refrigerator and sat at the kitchen table and stayed. The softest person in the family becomes the load-bearing wall. What nobody tells you is that sometimes it works the other way. Sometimes you're the one they forgot to account for, the one who was quiet long enough that they stopped watching. And when that person finally starts writing things down, starts making calls, starts forwarding voicemails to attorneys, that's not a problem for the family. That's the family finally working correctly.